I'm Jack Scott, and I'm the Executive Director of the Florida Atlantic University Center for Autism and Related Disabilities, CARD. Thank you for joining, and thank you for being interested in this topic. This is, of course, a very sensitive topic. If you're here, you understand, I have to believe the sensitivity of it, but we will be talking about suicide, which can result in the death of people. So kind of a heads up on that. And if you're going to be too uncomfortable with this topic, please, you'll want to tune out. In terms of disclaimers, I have no financial conflicts of interest that relate to any of this. And I just wanted to make sure I state that clearly. Let me pick up with my PowerPoint, and that will help keep me on track here. There we go. Here are a few points I want to make in relation to my connection with the topic of suicide. As the executive director of the FAU CARD program, and the FAU CARD program covers Palm Beach County on up north, Martin, St. Lucie, Indian River County, and then over to Okeechobee County. We're covering 1/10 of the state population here in Florida, and our main office is in Boca Raton. We have another set of offices in Jupiter, and then with Indian River State College, where we have an office in Port St. Lucie. But in our area, as in much of Florida, pools, water is everywhere. And I've been forced to be aware of how dangerous it is for people with autism. The death rate for our population, through a number of studies that are done, shows that that people with autism have about a 3-time greater death rate of death compared with people who don't have autism. This is pretty heavy duty. Children with autism probably have an even greater death rate. Through weaknesses in data sets, we don't always know when there is a fatality that a person will have autism. Their disability status does not always show up. So it's we don't have all of those data. We do know from data from the Florida Office of Vital Statistics that for 2017, 10% of the children who drowned in the state of Florida, 10% were children with autism. That's a pretty hefty number right there. Anyway, through safety that I became involved in, interested in this topic of suicide. And what really helped get me going on this, and I know several of my staff, was a support effort we had for an adult male with autism here in Palm Beach County. This is going back about 5 or 6 years ago now, who we were trying to help. He was in and out of Baker Act receiving facilities, kind of a revolving door. If he felt a sense of hopelessness the first time, that had to only increase as things went on. And as the hurricane this hurricane situation came up, he left the safety of his parents' home in Palm Beach County, went out into the elements, went into a wild area. There was no, so it's during a time when there was no police coverage, no fire due to the severity of one of the hurricanes. And he was found 2 days later by sheriff's deputies, dead from exposure. We don't know that was a suicide by hurricane, for sure, but in our minds it was. And certainly the intense stresses that he was under, the failure to get adequate mental health care were factors that made suicide seem like his best option. As sad as it was, but I think it helped move us forward to look at the mental health issues more broadly, which we are now doing. And I'll tell you about that in just a minute. And for me, it helped set me up to be sensitive to this question. I'm on the board of directors of the Autism Society of America, and very much enjoy that role, where I head up the Council of Autistic, I head up the panel of professional advisors, and they're working with the Council of Autistic Advisors, and it's okay to use the term autistic now. The autism self-advocacy community has a clear ruling on that they're fine with that, in spite of our special ed person first preference. They raised the issue with the Autism Society that suicide was a big deal. They knew it, and they thought much more could be done, both by the organization and nationwide. We convened with the Autism Society a task force on preventing autism suicide. I'm chairing that, and that's moving along quite well. We have a nationwide survey that is in place now. I'm doing this on the 21st of April 2022, and that survey is underway. It's been up for about 3 weeks, and we'll have it up for about another 3 weeks. We have over 200 responses at this point, and we're hoping for even more. So that task force has been meeting. We've been coming together with many ideas for what can be done to improve the suicide prevention climate for people with autism. And as you can imagine, awareness is a critical factor here. Fortunately, I've been linked with the American Association of Suicidology through with the help of Dr. Brenna Maddox, who is at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, with the TEACH program in the Department of Psychiatry there. Dr. Maddox has a major grant to look at suicide and persons with autism, and to a charge to develop an assessment, a specialized assessment that may well hold tremendous promise in recognizing a pattern of increased suicide risk among people on the autism spectrum. That's in development now. It's in the early stages of her grant efforts, but we hope that is quite successful. Here at FAU CARD, we have had a very special interest in the area of mental health, in part from that death I mentioned, but also for a number of other reasons. We're fortunate to have perhaps more grants than many of the other CARD centers. And so what I'm talking about is not in place at the other centers, and each has their own special attributes and special initiatives that they do. I would hope that we can in the future be funded to address the issues of ASD mental health, but right now we're really not, and we are able to deal with that through some grant-funded efforts. We're grateful to more than one foundation for their support in this area, especially the Harry T. Mangorian Foundation in Fort Lauderdale. They've been very, very generous to us, and we appreciate that. We're now looking at additional funding to try to develop a course, a training sequence that can be offered here at FAU and take advantage of the rich resources we have from both special ed, from social work, from our College of Medicine, from our mental health counseling faculty, as well as hopefully our nursing faculty and the psychiatric nursing faculty there, to help develop a comprehensive 35, 40-hour course on mental health for people with autism, to be an overlay for people who are currently mental health practitioners. We know from survey work and from an ongoing task force that we have where many of these mental health people are actively participating. And if any of them are listening, I want to thank them for their efforts and their active participation. But with this, we know that many mental health practitioners don't feel that they're capable of offering services to people with autism. They haven't been trained for that, and don't feel it's professional for them to do that, not within their scope of practice based on the lack of training. We hope with this, with our training efforts, that we can help change that, support those people, and make a difference. We know that people with autism have many of the same kinds of mental health issues that our full population have, but they can take on some special additional problems and become more intractable if not treated early, and if not treated skillfully. So they need access is the very, very important thing there, and they need access to skilled people. I hope we're able to report on the success of this effort. I know it's something I'm sticking with and will help make sure it happens. The problem of suicide is, I guess now with COVID, we hear much more about it. But it is certainly a major problem in the United States and worldwide. In some countries, it is more prominent than in the United States, but it is a major issue. And in the vast majority of cases, it can be prevented. There are indicators that people give that will help let those close to them know that something is very wrong. These become complicated in our autism population, and we may not read those correctly. That's some of what I'll be talking about. I want to read this bottom point here directly. As a sequel to suicide, pain and suffering of family members and others who cared for the deceased may remain palpable for years, and in some cases, lifetimes. This is all too true. Certainly the loss of any of our folks in the autism community is terrible, but the additional pain to family members goes on for years. As a result of doing this presentation and my work here in this area, people talk to me, confide in me that, yes, my brother, my sister, my aunt committed suicide. Often these aren't shared openly, such that they might share a death that was a death by a car accident or cancer. These are often kept more private, and keeping it private, I have to imagine, makes the suffering worse. Suicide is a big problem. There's no doubt about it. Each year in the U.S., 47,500 people. And then over 1.4 million have made an attempt. Okay, sorry, it keeps jumping here. Have made an attempt which would require some kind of professional intervention and care. How many additional attempts have been made that didn't call for professional intervention, which were not reported? We can only imagine, but it must be dramatically higher than that 1.4 million. So these are big numbers that we're talking about. The instrumentality effects are also not the focus of my talk here today, but the instrument chosen for the suicide plan has an awful lot to do with this. Person who intends to commit to kill themselves and die by suicide, if they're taking drugs, the lethality is less, obviously, than someone who plans to kill himself by way of a firearm, where the degree of lethality is quite a bit greater. We'd call this the instrumentality effect. And of course, in a state like Florida has very easy access to firearms for adults. The problem is of course made worse there. We know that suicide is more common for persons with disabilities. Cam and Crosby have this in the literature, but we know this also from many other sources. People with disabilities will often face challenges that those who are not disabled will not face. and may have multiple stresses, and in some cases just find life not to be worth living. And sadly, we do see this increased rate of suicide for the disabled population. And with the autism population, it appears that within the disability community, it is the highest that we're able to determine. Geez, sorry. The work of Clovis and her colleagues from Australia, reflecting on working with data from Denmark, has been very helpful. These recent studies provide some very solid indications. The Denmark data is very comprehensive, accessible to researchers, and offers some very good indicators of what may be happening. And we should recall that Denmark also has very high level of social service, among the highest in the world, where support for people with autism and other disabilities will be at a very high level. So that where we look at the suicide situation there, we have to imagine that it's lower than many other highly developed countries. But there they found that autism was among the populations with the highest risk for suicide. As we look at DSM-5 characteristics, we can see that some of these just really place people with autism at a higher risk. The tendency to perseverate on a topic, I think, is critical here. If that topic is ending a person's own life, a tendency to perseverate on the problems they have, this can really help to amplify, to intensify the feeling of hopelessness that seems to undergird the planning for suicide. Suicide ideation being the thinking of suicide, dwelling on it, planning for it, and then ultimately a suicide attempt. So the characteristics there certainly help to make it a more risky situation. Within that, we see, while not a formal DSM characteristic, but the issue of masking or camouflaging, both of these terms are being used fairly synonymously at this time. And I'll cite Sarah Cassidy as my authority for that. This idea of masking is that a person with autism will feel that they need to present a different face to the world, that they may feel no interest in socializing in a given situation, but feel that they need to put on a happy face so as to not be asked a million questions, not make others uncomfortable. And this kind of masking of their true self certainly enters into our suicide picture here. They may only seek help when they are already in a very severe state of distress. And even then, they may minimize or mask the true extent of their distress. The study I mentioned that's underway, I hesitate to share too much of this as it's still very preliminary, but we saw well over 30% of people said, yes, they did feel they needed to mask or camouflage their feelings, even when talking to suicide crisis line personnel or mental health people as it related to their suicidal ideations. This makes it hard to get to the real issues that are going on, and one that, if you're familiar with people with autism, you know that this can happen. Do we see it as much as in children? Almost certainly not. But the reports from adults and older adolescents with autism are making it clear that this is a topic of growing concern. Okay, there we go. The research by Clovis and colleagues is very surprising. I would encourage anyone who's attending this session to check that out. The references are listed at the end. You'll be able to access those. But she indicates that the strongest predictor of suicidal attempts and suicide, completed suicide for persons with autism, is the presence of at least one psychiatric diagnosis. And with that one additional psychiatric diagnosis, one psychiatric diagnosis will exclude autism as it is in the DSM, but we have one additional, that they estimated that there was a 9 times greater risk for suicide versus a person with autism who didn't have any of those. This comes into play with both our study's findings, but importantly with what we know about co-occurring conditions, commonly referred to as comorbid conditions, but increasingly referred to as co-occurring conditions. The comorbid just is a little too morbid of a term, I think, for many of us, and I'm glad that we're moving in that direction. But we know that over 70% of adults with autism have been diagnosed with at least one co-occurring psychiatric condition. Luke Kalb at Johns Hopkins University, a medical social work researcher there, is doing some remarkable work in the area of autism and autism mental health. We had him come down to FAU and do a session for our regional mental health clinicians. Very well received, and I would urge you to check his work out. It appears in major mental health journals. 70% with at least one here in a study of the US population. And then Kalb and colleagues estimate that 30 to 40% of this population will have 2 or more serious psychiatric diagnoses. When we put that together, we certainly meet the criteria that Clovis and colleagues discussed with the 9 times greater risk. So I think it's very fair to say that our ASD adult and older adolescent population is at a very, very high risk for serious mental health challenges, and certainly suicide is chief among those. So we need to be very mindful of that. With this high-risk status, I'd like to think that the national suicide prevention community would be very much tuned into this. We have the American Association on Suicidology. We have SAMHSA, the major federal program to fund mental health and substance abuse, but that all of these would be highly attuned to the problems and needs of people with autism. But this really does not appear to be the case. The status of veterans, which is a terrible situation in terms of how many veterans plan to kill themselves and do die by suicide. It's a tragedy there, and we see strengthened efforts to help with that. But it is acknowledged, as it absolutely should be, as a major, major problem. People with the wide range of gender issues and our Native Americans are acknowledged as special populations that need additional outreach, additional care, additional research to deal with those problems. But autism has not yet received this status, and it is certainly the disability group that is at the highest risk and needs to be included within that unfortunate collection of populations that have this very high-risk status. This becomes especially important as we move to the nationwide 988 efforts scheduled to take effect nationwide July 1st of 2022. and which will kind of help replace the, across the country, there are many different call-in arrangements for crisis lines. Some come into a general health center, but here we have federal support for a unified 988 system across the country. The American Association of Suicidology, this primary organization for training standards for crisis call staff, does not really require any autism-specific content, nor does SAMHSA at the federal level. SAMHSA helps to provide resources, but tries not to dictate what the content will be. So it's a more subtle set of arrangements there. So, and this is where advocacy will come into play. Nationally, individual call centers may not include training for autism, so that their call specialist will be more attuned to the special needs of people with autism as they call in. I'm happy to report that both Palm Beach, our Treasure Coast 211 system, which covers Palm Beach and the counties just north of us, and Broward 211, both do provide some dedicated staff training in ASD. And for our card staff who are in on listening to this call, or district staff, let me encourage you to work with your local call centers, your regional call centers, to ask them to help provide that. There are people, I'm sure, at every one of the card centers who can help provide very good training on this. But it's not going to, if it's not happening now, help make it happen. You'll find the call centers will be amenable, eager to include this kind of training in their training calendar if it's offered, and if it's offered by people who know what they're talking about. So please help make sure that it's available across the state of Florida. Nationwide, it's a very mixed profile, where some places it is very strong, and in other places it's very weak in relation to our autism population. It's needed everywhere. It's needed everywhere. So I'm mentioning the crisis lines in terms of how effective are they in actually preventing suicide. And here, while this is very important, of course, the Blanchard and colleagues have a very interesting study that shows that self-harm and for the autism, people on the autism spectrum is fairly, is fairly high. We know this, we see this to a large degree with children, but often not to such a degree that it requires any medical or attention or hospitalization. But the pattern of self-injurious behavior can potentially put people in a direction of a greater risk for suicide. So we need to be careful here. Out of 36 results analyzed in their meta-analysis, 29 studies have found a significantly higher rate of self-harm, and or suicidality than in the typically developing group. So in addition, the researchers estimate that 42% of autistic people perform self-injurious behaviors where there may not be an intention to have a suicide, but in some cases, things may escalate to where death occurs. So some rough numbers to be dealing with there. I'd like to kind of introduce Sarah Cassidy. You see her picture here. She is worldwide one of the leaders in this, and perhaps a very important player, certainly within the United Kingdom. She is at the University of Nottingham in the UK. And I would especially urge you to take a look at her work with a number of other people. in the INSAR policy brief that came out just last year. She headed up a task force for INSAR, the International Society for Autism Research, which holds its conference in 3 weeks in Austin, Texas. I encourage you to go if you're very interested in autism. It is a very serious research conference. It will be attended by, more than 2,000 people, I have to imagine. But she has worked on this quite heavily, and I'm going to credit her with helping to link the issues of masking, camouflaging, and how they complicate the identification of a suicidal pattern for many people with autism. Here in the US, I certainly want to recognize Lisa Morgan, who is a therapist who works with people with autism. Here's her material written in collaboration with the American Association of Suicidology, and for many years existed as really the only material out there to guide the suicide prevention community in terms of helping to work with people with suicide and to help guide them. You see Lisa's website here. She is, we've had her present, I've seen her present in several forums. She has autism as well, which I think allows her to be uniquely capable in terms of helping us understand these issues. So from this article here, this is a picture of the article, pulling out some of the key points from her work. She has what she calls a toolkit, and I really see it as required reading for all crisis call center staff and for mental health clinicians who provide support for a person with autism. For many of us who know quite a bit about autism, much of it will be quite obvious, but we have to recognize that most mental health people are not tuned into autism. And crisis call center staff across the country, many of them are volunteers. They're typically not therapists. In some cases they are, but the assurance there is not that they will be therapists, but that they're rather people who are carefully screened, given some training, people of goodwill, but they're not therapists. They're there to help people in crisis. And many of them simply don't know anything about autism. And this toolkit is an effort to help make sure they do know the basics as they work by phone or by text with people with autism. Among some of the key pieces of advice that Lisa Morgan provides is that that people with autism will have these difficulties expressing their sensory difficulties, that issues in terms of sight, sound, touch, smell often make it very difficult for them to get along, and can take on a very special power in making their life difficult and unmanageable. I imagine from a phone standpoint, a bad connection for someone who's sound sensitive must be a real challenge, especially in a time of emotional heightening, such as calling into a suicide crisis hotline. They may present with emotions, the person with autism, quite opposite of being in a crisis. We hear and have heard from some of the crisis line operators that, yes, they may laugh. They may treat it as if it's almost a joke, where it's not a joke, but the opposite or paradoxical reaction can be problematic in a person on the crisis line saying, are you serious about this? And they're as serious as can be, but their emotions may be quite the opposite. Be prepared for that. Or people with autism will have often great difficulty identifying or verbalizing emotions. And typically the crisis call people are steeped in putting this into an emotional context. How are you feeling? Tell me how you feel. Will be common openers on this kind of thing. Well, people with autism tend not to be good in those areas. So understanding that this will be an area of great difficulty for most of our people with autism. And related to that, they may not know how to cope with, excuse me, or what to do with emotions. This becomes a major challenge. This becomes important in terms of the need for access to mental health and for our teaching at the certainly at all grade levels to help people with autism get in touch with their emotions, their social skills, their social capacity in a general sense, and certainly how they can get in touch with themselves. The last point here in my summary is that they will tend to demonstrate very literal thinking and understanding. And we see Morgan urging the call specialist to try to put things in to the greatest degree possible into quite non-emotional language, to avoid figures of speech, to use straight talk with the folks with autism. Here are some of the key pieces of advice that she has. Let's be aware that the folks will have experienced countless misunderstandings and miscommunications. They often, in talking to even close friends and family, there'll be back and forth many times in order to get a message out. That these folks will have difficulty or an inability to make friends and sustain relationships. If a call specialist were to ask, well, what do your friends say? They may say, well, I don't really have any friends. That may seem very unusual for a person who doesn't have autism, but for many of our people with autism, it would not be that unusual. They may have very few friends, or in some cases, no friends. They may, in a general sense, feel disconnected and isolated from society, such that that may not be an indicator of current suicidal ideation. And this is a common one, and I've heard this from some of the call specialists, that this perseveration issues, the tendency to just fix onto one topic and to keep on coming back to that repeatedly. The rumination on thoughts, situations, circumstances. I was fired unfairly from my job. I was fired unfairly. They didn't treat me right. They didn't treat me right. They didn't fire Wendy. She did the same thing. They didn't fire Wendy. She did the same thing, but they fired me. It was totally unfair. That kind of pattern can be, and it can be difficult for the crisis people to know what to do with. Less difficult if they understand more about people with autism. The crisis specialists need to know that we can often see unusual patterns of speech, odd tone, pitch, sometimes somewhat of a robotic kind of speech. Processing speed, closely linked to this, can be slower, can take people a lot longer to process, especially if they're trying to then process emotional information that may almost require a translation. Think of Temple Grandin and in her Thinking in Pictures, where she talks about her process of visually processing and then trying to put into speech. This process occurs for so many people in our autism community. And then the use of echolalia, repeating words, sounds, responses, can be a surprise to many who are not familiar with that, and something that needs to be factored in. Thank you, Lisa Morgan, for your great work here in this regard. And if there's one piece of information that you'd want to share with the crisis call people, let it be the material that you'd find here from Lisa Morgan. She gives these specific pieces of advice to the call specialist. Ask clear, direct questions. Use fewer words. Be straight to the point. Not multiple questions posed as one. Clear, direct. Extra time to process thoughts and formulate words. Take your time. Help shift the thoughts. Ask about interest or passions. If someone gets hung up on that perseverative, I lost my job, all hope is lost, Ask about, do you have some special interest? What do you like? Try to get it onto a more positive direction. All people with autism, in my experience, have special interests, and there's good stuff in all of that. Avoid using metaphors, social nuances, allegories, slang. Keep it as straight and direct as possible. Speak using logical words, not emotional words. How are you feeling? Let's leave that out. Explain positive coping skills, how they're helpful. Yes, here's some things we can do. You do need to talk to your counselor. Things like that can be directly helpful. Make sure you're eating right. Make sure you're getting to sleep right. This last point, this really could be the topic of an entire session like this, but the need to help facilitate a safety plan. The safety plan is critical. And a person with autism who is working with a mental health clinician, psychiatrist, other, will almost certainly have a safety plan. They should have a safety plan. If they don't have one, and they're working with those folks, they need to do this on their next visit, in my opinion. But they need to help have a plan for what will happen if they begin to have more active, more fluid suicidal ideation. What will you do? The specifics on that. I'll call Marion, my counselor. She lets me, I can text her 24 hours. If this doesn't work, I will go to this mental health facility, or I'll go to this Baker Act receiving facility, or I'll go to this hospital emergency room. There needs to be a clear safety plan, and people with autism, we know this from our kids in school, are good with routine. They're good with a routine where they can understand the exact steps to follow in that plan or routine. The safety plan can be a true lifesaver and needs to be in place. Safety plans for people who are at risk for suicide are not unique to people with autism by any means, but they need to be a feature of their plan. This planning can only be done on a brief, very abbreviated way here in a call to a suicide crisis line, but they need to be in place for anyone who is seeing a clinician. A material that Brenna Maddox at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill teach in the Department of Psychiatry there, and Lisa Morgan have put together and just released last fall. I got permission for Dr. Maddox to help share this and have, but it's improving suicide prevention practices for people on the autism spectrum. It is a very valuable material, and I encourage you to see the full paper. And here we see the typical recommendations for suicide prevention for people who do not have autism are important, and many of them overlap, but they don't all kind of line up correctly. For example, a special interest in death. For a person who doesn't have autism, that could be a very strong indicator of suicide potential. But there are some people with autism who have that as a longstanding special interest, and it may not be indicative of any increased suicide risk. So it's important to understand some of these things. And I think they do an excellent job of putting those kinds of what may be common problems of people with autism or common differences into the context of this suicide mix. Here we see listed them, the key issues here in terms of the warning signs of suicide in people with autism spectrum. And I'll go through each of them as I end this presentation. A sudden or increased withdrawal. The increase or sudden onset being the key here. Many autistic persons are characteristically withdrawn. So the fact that someone may keep to themselves, be fairly isolated, may not in and of itself be an indication of suicidal ideation, suicide potential that's increased. But it's the increase that would be the key marker here for persons in the autism, with autism. No words to communicate acute distress. People who become extremely distressed, contemplating suicide, I'm sure they lack the words to communicate that. But these communication deficits in general are just such a core characteristic of people with autism. They may not know how to communicate high levels of happiness either. So it can be a compounding risk factor there. A current traumatic event, a strong indicator. This event may not be shared with others. A lady who gets fired from her job, but Wendy didn't, that kind of thing may really just have a very special power for a person with autism. And it may so often not be shared widely. And there it makes it even much more dangerous. Marked increase in rate and/or severity of self-harm. And here it's important to note it's not just the presence of self-harm. That alone is not the ticket, but rather the increase. We know, and I shared some data on this, that self-harm is not uncommon for persons with autism, typically of a fairly mild form. So if someone on the call center is asking, do you engage in any self-harm? Well, that may be characteristic of their general way of getting along, and not necessarily indicative of a dramatically increased risk of suicide. Worsening of anxiety or depression. The worsening here being the key. As I mentioned, Kalb et al. Suggest that there's 70% or so of our autism population have anxiety or depression. Here, the worsening is the key indicator. A new focus on death-related topics that are not a special interest. The focus on special interest for people with autism is so prominent. And some adults with ASD will have death as a special interest. If it's a new special interest, great cause for concern. And if it is, a death-related topic, concern anyway, but not one that, we need to be as concerned about as if it's a altogether new or dramatically more prominent within that person. If you're working with someone who has a death-related topic, that is their special interest, see what you can do to shift that if you can. So, perseverative suicidal thoughts and ruminations. This indicator is shared with the general population as an urgent concern. People who are contemplating suicide often tell us that this has been brewing with them, and that they perseverate, they ruminate on these thoughts. And with people with autism, that pattern is often there for them to latch onto something and to perseverate on it. Seeking means or making plans for suicide or suicide rehearsal. This is one of the key indicators for any population, not just our autism population, but it takes things to a new and much more urgent level. When a person were to specify, I have collected pills, I'm going to use them. I know where my grandfather keeps a shotgun and the ammo for it, and I'm going to go to his farm, and here's what I'm going to do. When we have planning, specific planning, a powerful indicator that must be taken very seriously. Statement about no reason for living and no sense of purpose in life. Many people with ASD may feel like this and camouflage or mask their issues in this regard in an effort to conform and say, I really don't see any purpose in living. Well, that's going to get you a lot of concern, a lot of attention you don't want. So some of them probably may feel that way and just figure, not going to open it up. But when we do find that that's the case, or if they've masked it and we can open that up, we need to take that very seriously. And then hopelessness. This is perhaps for many the key sign, an indicator of a much greater risk of suicide. Hopelessness becoming so powerful. We need to help make sure people have focus on the reasons to live and not on any reasons to die. If we can help people avoid a completed suicide, we have their chances of living a good life are wonderful beyond that. But if they do die by suicide, then that really ends it. So we need to be very, very sensitive to that. I do want to mention at this point that I want to thank you. And to obtain the certificate of completion that you'll need, you'll want to enter this code. And that code, the code is JS05-2022. I'll repeat that, JS05-2022. And please get that. And you go in on the invitation, I think, to do that. Here are some of our references on this. And I would hope to get your help on this. If you're connected to a card center in Florida, please do what you can to activate your card. I know we all differ in terms of our resources, but I'd urge you to reach out to the mental health community, to partner with them, to your philanthropic community. We're finding great sensitivity in our philanthropic community to these autism mental health concerns, and to your autism advocacy community. I think together we can bring about the full array of mental health supports needed by persons with autism, especially when they're in crisis. And I do want to say that your participation in our for the people who are in our card mental health forums, I do want to thank them because their support and their participation has been helpful in bringing about a more responsive community in our region. But hopefully this helps to, in part, ignite interest in these topics statewide. Here's my contact info, Jack Scott at fau.edu, and my phone number. Feel free to call me. And I'm very eager to do anything I can to help promote these issues. I will be presenting at the NAMI conference in September in Orlando with Cheryl Checkers. I should mention Cheryl Checkers, who is our autism mental health consultant for CARD, funded through the Harry T. Mangorian Foundation. We're very glad to have Cheryl with us and to have her in-depth and long expertise in autism and in mental health. So in a regular presentation, I'd be prepared to take questions here and usually I get quite a few, but in this webinar format, I'll have to leave that for another time and welcome your questions to me by email or phone. Thank you very much, and please be alert to these issues, help advocate for better crisis supports for people with autism and more availability of quality mental health services for people with autism. Thank you. Have a good day. Bye-bye.